4,000 years ago, a priest in Babylon looked up at the night sky and started keeping records. It wasn't for romance, it wasn't for personality quizzes, not for knowing if his situationship with a Gemini was working out. He was tracking the movements of Venus because he believed the gods spoke through the sky. And if you could read the pattern, you could predict floods and famine, war, the fate of kings. And this is where astrology starts. It wasn't on an app, not on a poster in a college dorm room, in the oldest observatories on Earth, with clay tablets recording the rise and fall of planets centuries before anyone had a word for gravity. And the Babylonians split the sky into 12 sections and matched them to constellations. And that's the skeleton of the zodiac we still use today. The Greeks got their hands on it next, and this is the part people forget, that astrology wasn't separate from astronomy back then. They were the same discipline. But Ptolemy, the same man who mapped the stars for navigation and mathematics, also wrote the Tetrabiblios, the book that basically invented Western astrology as we know it. And for most of human history, tracking the planets and believing they shaped your fate weren't two different belief systems. They were one job. And the science then split off. The Enlightenment happened, telescopes got better, and astronomy walked away from astrology like an ex who got a good haircut and a better job. By the 1900s, astrology had been pushed to the cultural fringe, mostly surviving in newspaper horoscope columns, tucked between the comics and the crossword, reduced to 12 lines of vague comfort based on nothing but your sun sign and, your birth month. And that's basically where it stayed for almost a century. A backup personality quiz, something your grandma, read out loud at breakfast, something people quietly believed in but rarely said out loud in professional settings because it wasn't taken seriously. And admitting you checked your horoscope was kind of a slightly embarrassing thing to say in a mixed company. And then two things happened that nobody in the astrology world saw coming. Smartphones and a decade defined by collective anxiety. The first crack in the wall was an app called CoStar. It was launched in 2017, which took birth chart astrology, the deep stuff, sun, moon, rising, Venus, Mars, and the 12 houses, and it turned it into push notifications. It was just like so easily accessible. And suddenly you didn't need to buy a book or find an astrologer. You just needed your exact birth time and a phone. And then Instagram meme accounts turned zodiac traits into shareable content. The kind of post you tag your friends, and because it's either like eerily accurate or so wrong, it's funny, either way. But the real explosion, the one that turned astrology from a niche interest into a genuine internet subculture, happened on TikTok. And TikTok didn't just host astrology content, it restructured how astrology gets consumed. So a horoscope column gives you one static paragraph a day. TikTok's algorithm gives you an infinite personalized stream of birth chart breakdowns, compatibility readings, transit updates, and sign-specific commentary. And it was refined in real time based on what you linger on. So if you watched 3 Scorpio videos, the platform hands you 30 more. And it's not a horoscope anymore. It's just a feed that learns exactly which flavor of cosmic self-reflection keeps you scrolling. Bite-sized zodiac content, relatable memes, and viral birth chart analyses started dominating the algorithm-driven leads. And a short video explaining something like Mercury retrograde could just rack up millions of views in a way a newspaper column never could. But the format alone doesn't explain why an entire generation adopted it. Plenty of trends moved fast on TikTok and died just as fast. And astrology didn't die, though. It got more serious. And the reason has less to do with planets and more to do with what was happening in the world while all of this was unfolding. So, Gen Z came of age during a pileup of crises, financial precarity, pandemic, climate anxiety, a mental health crisis that made therapy both more normalized and less affordable, all hitting at once during the exact years people are supposed to be figuring out who they are. And what a lot of researchers and cultural writers have pointed out is that younger people didn't pick up astrology because they suddenly started believing planets controlled their destiny. They picked it up because it gave them language. Gen Z and younger millennials have been described as approaching astrology not as entertainment, but as a framework for psychological grounding, a way to explore identity formation processes, which processes unresolved emotional patterns and make sense of inner experiences they were never taught, how to talk about in the first place. So think about what a birth chart actually offers someone. It's not a prediction. It's a mirror with labels on it. Your moon sign gives you a way to talk about your emotional instincts. Your rising sign gives you language for how you show up in the first impressions. And your Mars placement becomes shorthand for how you handle conflict. And none of this requires believing that Mars, the actual planet, is causing your temper. It just requires wanting a vocabulary for self-reflection that doesn't sound as a clinical as a diagnosis and doesn't cost $150 an hour. And this is the part that most commentary about astrology's comeback misses or mentions in passing without really sitting in it. Is astrology in 2026 isn't operating as prophecy. It's operating as psychology with better branding. And people aren't checking their horoscopes to find out if today is lucky. They're using synastry charts to process why a relationship fell apart, or using their Saturn return to explain why their late 20s felt like everything was cracking open at once. Using the language of archetypes, the hero's journey, cycles and seasons to make meaning out of a decade that has fell for a lot of people. Relentlessly chaotic and hard to explain in any other terms. And there's also a quieter reason astrology fits this generation so well. And it's about authorship. A lot of Gen Z grew up watching institutions they were told to trust quietly fail them and get a lot of official predictions wrong. And traditional structures of meaning, like religious, institutional, economic, felt less reliable than they were sold as. And astrology, whatever you think of its scientific validity, hands the interpretation back to the individual. Nobody else gets to tell you what your chart means. You read the placements, you sit with them, you decide what resonates and what doesn't. And in a decade, that looked a lot like, authority away from people. Astrology quietly handed a small piece of it back to them. So they felt like that authorship. Anyway, none of this means astrology suddenly became less controversial. Astronomers and scientific organizations still point out correctly that there's no empirical evidence linking planetary positions to human personality or fate. That criticism hasn't gone away, and it shouldn't. But it mostly misses the actual function astrology is serving for the people using it. And most people scrolling through a synastry breakdown at midnight aren't making a scientific claim. They're using a shared symbolic language the same way people use tarot, enneagram types, or even just casual talk about introverts and extroverts, to organize experience into something a little more graspable. So here's where astrology actually sits right now. In a place it's never occupied before. It started as literal science before science and belief split apart. It spent a century demoted to a newspaper filler column. And now, on the other side of a decade defined by uncertainty, it's been rebuilt from the ground up, not by astrologers, but by an algorithm and a generation that needed a way to talk about who they are. The zodiac didn't come back because people started believing the stars control their lives. It came back because it gave millions of people scrolling alone at 1 a.m. a language for the parts of themselves they didn't have words for yet. So whether or not you believe a single word of it, that's not nothing.